So welcome. Thank you everyone for joining us tonight. We'll talk about middle housing, Unified Development Code Amendment, and kind of some of the feedback and some of the research that we've done related to some of the requirements from the state and how we're addressing that. So to start off, just some meeting agreements for the group. Um, Please be concise. Allow everyone to speak before speaking again, just to make sure that everyone has a chance to kind of ask questions or provide any comments. Be respectful of others and different viewpoints. We best to try to stay on topic as much as possible. And then we have your safe questions till the end of the presentation section. So we do have some points in the presentation where we'll pause, get some kind of feedback through a Mentimeter, but also have opportunity to provide comments. If if you have clarifying questions or things of that sort, feel free to throw those in the chat. We have some people here who can kind of follow up and try to help with those. But most of the discussion, really, there are points in the presentation for that discussion. And then ultimately, the meeting is being recorded. So just wanted to make sure everyone is aware of it. Next slide. So, team introductions. I'm Dan Bursick. I am the planning administrator for Planning and Development Services. Also working on this project are Amanda Smith, who's a lead planner here, Nicholas Martell, who is the section manager of long range planning. We also have several other staff members who are joining us. We have Cesar Acosta, who is a principal planner and project manager for Plan Tucson. Corn Manning, who is the director of planning and development services, as well as Sarah Megason, who's from Housing and Community Development. Next slide. Wanted to just kind of start it off, just so we kind of get an understanding of who's in the room and who's joining us. So if you'd like to, I'd like you to please share kind of your name, general location of where you live, such as the name of your neighborhood, and really what interests you about middle housing and this project and why you're here tonight to join us. So we'll let you kind of fill those out as we're going through, but really do appreciate you joining us. So tonight we are planning to present on middle housing background. So going through House Bill 2721 and kind of the minimum required changes, as well as some direction from mayor and council. We're going to go through, get some input on some options. We've been working with Drockman Institute to kind of analyze one, what the requirements are, but also how to potentially come into compliance and what some other options might be. And then review of some kind of additional implications of House Bill 2721 as well. Hoping here to really just inform on the background of the requirement changes, get some community input on those options, and then discuss those implications for the next phase. Next slide, please. So middle housing, really the reason why, one of the reasons why we're kind of talking to you and is really came out of House Bill 2721 for middle housing. And this was part of a group of housing bills signed in 2024. As you may know, we worked on a bill related to accessory dwelling units. We also worked on a bill related to adaptive reuse and rezoning timelines. There were a whole bunch of housing bills that came out in 2024. This one required municipalities with a population of more than 75,000 to adopt regulations to allow middle housing within a mile of the central business district of all lots zoned for single family residential use. And then there's another portion of it that required at least 20% of new development of more than 10 contiguous acres must allow for that, at least it has to allow for at least 20% middle housing or to allow for it on acres, projects that are 10 acres or more. Middle housing in this bill is defined as duplexes, triplexes, and fourplexes, or detached residential development consisting of 2 to 4 units, essentially, for that on every lot. There are some other things kind of related to this. Municipality cannot set restrictions, permitting or review processes for middle housing that are more restrictive than those for single family dwellings within the same zone. Um, and then ultimately, if the municipality doesn't adopt and integrate regulations by January 1st, 2026, middle housing shall be allowed on all lots zoned for single family residential without limitations. That's the reason why we're here coming through and doing this. Next slide. So just want to talk a little bit about kind of just middle housing types in Tucson. And, it is a common type that we have in the city already in a lot of areas, and especially in the areas that, the kind of state directed us to look at. It really does look at things like duplexes, three and fourplexes, and townhomes. Um, but also you can potentially do, a small cottage court, which would be like 4 units on a single lot. Middle housing in itself really does span into larger options, such as live work apartments, 2 to 3.5 story structures. But this doesn't really address that. It's really the stuff towards the left of the screen that we have here. We did want to show you kind of just a couple just examples of how this, just different neighborhoods that have this type of housing and how they are. So next slide. But yes, before I get to that, I moved this slide around right before the presentation. Missing middle housing, it really, we did an analysis of looking at different housing types that we have in the city of Tucson, and about 15% of our housing stock are townhomes, duplexes, and then those triplexes and quadplexes. We do have, 52.7% of our homes and housing is single family detached homes. And as you can kind of see here, we do pretty well at doing the really kind of the smaller kind of I guess single family homes and then the larger kind of apartment complexes, but just don't do quite as well with the stuff in the middle, which is like kind of that medium scale development. Next slide. So just some examples of kind of what we've seen and areas that we see this in. This right here is an example of a duplex with an ADU in Feldman's that currently exists in the city. Next slide. This is an example again of another duplex. This is a duplex side by side in Sam Hughes. This is in an R2 zone, but again, Sam Hughes has a pretty wide variety of different types of housing. Next slide. This is one in Jefferson Park. This is a triplex. This is NR, I guess it's NR2. It's in the area to the west of Jefferson Park, but a triplex that's there in Jefferson Park. Next slide. This is an example of just townhomes that we have along Speedway, along in Barrio Hollywood that we have there. This is R2 as well. Next slide. And then here are some attached row homes. We have attached row homes like this one in Sam Hughes. And then the next slide. We have some examples of other neighborhoods as you get further away from the downtown, even in places like Arroyo Chico, where we do have attached row homes for that. And then even cottage courts, and we see a lot of these in and around the central area, the central Tucson. But again, cottage courts, which are like those kind of bungalow courts, where you have little kind of either attached or detached small units in there. The interesting thing about a lot of these is that a lot of them are non-conforming, and so our zoning code previously, before our zoning code, a lot of these were allowed. But when we put our zoning code into place after 1940 and 1947, a lot of them were made legally non-conforming uses, and we don't allow for the development of a lot of these types currently. Next slide. So another reason why we're looking at this, and even though it is being dictated by the state, is really just looking at housing supply and housing supply in the city of Tucson. We did a study back in December. This was kind of something we presented during our community corridors tool as well. But our 10-year estimate of housing need in the city of Tucson is looks at about 35,000 units that we need to produce within the next 10 years for that. It's really divergent. A lot of that is in the 0 to 30 and 30 to 60% area median income, which is like subsidized affordable housing. It's like the stuff that housing and community development does. Or a lot of nonprofits do for that with their low income housing tax credits. But 11,000 plus is in a need of greater than 120,000 area median income. And really, what that is a lot of in-migration. And if you don't produce enough of that, a lot of times it tends to start to affect other portions of the market through filtering. And you see it having actually impacts on the 80 to 120%, which is, the kind of what they call naturally affordable housing, essentially. Next slide. And so part of the reason why it's important when you start to look at middle housing is really looking at kind of, the affordability of the types of units that you're building. And so this looks at housing formats and looks at their affordability. And the two highlighted here are small detached single units. So things like small single family homes potentially or townhomes. And, looking at 120 to 150% area median income. And then the other one really is those multifamily condos, townhomes as well, really targeted for first-time buyers, young professionals, older adults, and single parents, and that's 80 to 120% AMI. When you compare that to something like a large detached single unit, you look at something that really a lot of times is 200 plus area median income. So if you only are building large detached single family homes, you're leaving out a large portion of your community that might need more affordable units, but still want to live in certain places or be able to potentially own. Next slide. So I talked a little bit about this, but how middle housing helps, it really does add choices to housing supply to meet income and generational needs. It's creating more convenient, walkable communities by adding more people so it can support the services around it and make them walkable. It helps to support efficient city infrastructure, so building on existing infrastructure instead of building new infrastructure in new areas potentially, and transit projects, making it easier for local businesses to thrive in populated areas. Again, having enough people to support those businesses and nearby to support those businesses, and then just ultimately, building community with closer neighbors and shared and supported living spaces and providing that variety of different housing types and house for different housing needs. Next slide. So there are barriers to middle housing beyond just zoning. Our zoning code has definitely made this challenging in a lot of cases, but some of those are things like economic. There is not a good financial return on these types. One, two, three, and four housing units on existing midterm sites is very expensive and it's challenging to build. That's what came out of the Drachman Institute study, and it's really reflective of kind of why we're not seeing a lot of this. Financing, investor preference is really for established developers, but also for established development types. So it's hard to get investors to actually support these. Zoning, we have kind of a mix of things that make this challenging. One of those is just that 3+ units is classified as commercial development, which leads to longer processes, potentially special processes as well, and more standards a lot of times for those. So having paved parking lots and all these other things that go along with those. Existing properties, there's just limited vacant sites. So the physical dimension of actual properties just cause problems. And then R1 site limits, there's complicated standards, number of bedrooms, number of placement of parking. A lot of things related to R1 make it very challenging as well. Next slide. It is definitely, we've talked about plan policy and we've talked about kind of mayor and council policy with community quarters tool, but this as well. There are a lot of plans and plan policy that do support this. Things like our PCHIP plan that was just adopted by mayor and council. Increasing the affordable and attainable housing options. This is, more looking at attainable housing than necessarily affordable housing. There were policies in Norte Sur to support this, initiating development codes to support transit-oriented development. Again, this helps to build that density to help to allow for walkable kind of more walkable areas to transit. And then there's a litany of policies in Plan Tucson 2023, 2013, but also in 2025 that really look at ways to provide more affordable housing in neighborhoods, ways to support aging in place, and just really looking at all kind of types of residential development. Next slide. So currently, they're actually, even though I mentioned that in a lot of these areas we've kind of zoned out some of these, there are options if you have a large enough lot in a lot of cases to potentially develop middle housing. So R1, kind of what's currently allowed, R1 is our normal single family zone, residential one. And it allows for single family residential and it allows for townhomes, which are attached single family residential units. However, if you want two units on there or a duplex or something of that sort, you really need a 10,000 square foot lot or larger to do so. Or you for that. There aren't don't allow for triplexes or fourplexes, or for any multifamily units of five or more. Because of one state law and the changes we made, you are allowed to put 80 accessory dwelling units on there, up to two. Unless there are already two units, then you can only do one, and that's just kind of how our standards are for that. It's one thing to kind of point that out too, is just the fact that existing, as is existing with the ADU law and the ADU changes that we made, you really can do three units, or potentially up to four if you want to make one of the, if it's large enough, a lot, an acre large or larger, and affordable, you can do up to four units in some cases. So it's just kind of pointing out that the changes that we'll be talking about aren't really much different than what's currently allowed in a lot of places. So R2 and R3 already allowed to do single family residential homes. As well as duplexes, triplexes and fourplexes you can, but they have those commercial standards, which make it very challenging to do so, as well as the five plus multifamily apartments. The density limits are pretty low in R2 compared to R3, so it does make it challenging sometimes. And you can have ADUs similar to the other sites. And then commercial and office zones, exactly the same as R2 and R3, except you have higher density limits for those. Next slide. So what is currently allowed and then what's new, the stuff in the kind of burnt orange kind of coloring is what's really changing and what really gets addressed in this. And it's really when you come down to those triplexes and fourplexes, for that. And actually duplexes as well. And so those would end up being, yes, with residential standards and allowing for those new, like, 2 to 4 unit structures on those lots. And it would be on any residential lot that this applies to. And then, typical maximum number of permitted units, that would go up to four for R1. R2 and R3 in commercial and office, again, it varies just depending on the size of the lot because they already allow for multifamily, but it's based on the size of the lot and the density and some of those other dimensional standards. Next slide. So with this, the minimum standards really that we're looking at for House Bill 2721 is looking at within a downtown area, middle and single family housing must follow the same procedures and standards. And Amanda will talk a bit about this as well, but that downtown area, it's kind of we are able to define it as a common downtown area, but it's something that we're going to be asking you for feedback on. Commercial standards now apply to five plus units development instead of three plus. So everything five and greater would be commercial, and then it would be residential standards for one through four. Um, Height must allow 2 stories, but that's what is already allowed. So that's in alignment with our current zoning code and a lot of our residential zones. Parking no more than one off-street per unit. That's what we currently require for 1 to 4 units anyway, so it's very similar to what we currently require. And then definitions of household, single family attached, and some likely others, we're going to have to make some changes to as well. And Nick will talk a little bit about that in a second. Building code alignment. So there are requirements in here where you can't require sprinklers, and you basically have to allow for people to utilize the residential code. They can still use the commercial code, but the International Building Code, but there are requirements for that. And then we're going to likely have to make some changes to large area development, flexible lot developments, and subdivisions. Next slide. We did hold a study session with our mayor and council on this on April 22nd, and they directed us to really look at a wide variety of options, really looking at potentially more flexible development standards. So maybe looking at height, looking at setbacks, minimum lot size. How can we make this so it functions better than kind of just just allowing for up to 4 units. They told us to look at different geographies, so what's required, but then also maybe looking at something that's citywide potentially, or something that is in certain places where it makes more sense. Um, they also talked a bit about phasing potentially, and looking at just minimum requirements now, and then longer term, kind of looking at other areas of the city. Design standards for landscaping, pedestrian circulation. Nick will talk a little bit about this, but because of the structure of this, now we have to require residential standards for everything up to 4. There aren't design standards currently or landscaping standards for one single family home. So we'll have to figure out that one and how that works. And then phased approach, as I mentioned there, and modifications standards over time. With that, I'm just going to pass it over to Amanda to talk about some of the options.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Dan. Thank you so much for covering all of that. Yeah, so this is where we're going to transition into talking a little bit about where some of our wiggle room is, and we want to get your feedback. So thank you so much for coming out tonight. I'm going to be providing an overview of our options and then giving some details, which will then follow with a Q&A discussion, help make sure we're understanding everything that we're talking about, and then we'll be asking for your preferences. So I want to give a shout out to the Drockman Institute with University of Arizona, who helped identify these options as a starting point, which we're providing as examples. And we're not limited to these, and we really want your feedback. There might be some other ways that we can do this that we're not presenting. Please let us know. And then, of course, just a reminder that we're going to be, or there's potential to take a phased approach. And there are some things that must occur during the timeline that's set by the House bill, but there are other good ideas that we might be able to do in the near term, or we can do them in future phases. So just keep that in mind as we're discussing our options and how we might proceed moving forward. So the general overview of our options kind of fit into 2 categories: how, which is our dimensional standards, and where, which is geography. Geography we'll talk about more second, but basically there's a minimum area that we mentioned, that 1-mile buffer around a downtown area, and then there's options for doing that. Or we could expand beyond the minimum required by the bill, which is along major corridors or citywide. But first we want to talk more about the dimensional standards. We could either do just the minimum changes to comply with the bill and stop there, or we could make some minimum changes plus increasing flexibility. So let's talk about that a little bit more. So option A, which is maintain the current standards beyond making the requirements, the changes required by the bill. And so the challenges here is that because this will apply anywhere where single family residential is currently allowed, it may hinder some of that 4-unit development without demolishing existing structures. And so in order to help provide some flexibility, make it a little bit more easy to build around existing structures, we're considering option B, which is adding some flexibility, making those minimum required changes, and then looking at modifying a variety of things to reduce setbacks, reduce lot coverage, possibly also looking at reducing lot sizes, increasing height in some zones. We could talk about all of this in a moment. And basically the goal of this option B would be to allow more lots to be able to fit housing and potentially get better designs due to greater flexibility. So those visuals down there at the bottom were created by the Drockman Institute to show a hypothetical example of what's achievable under the minimum, or the current, which would be the minimum changes. And option B is allowing more flexibility, looking at our ADU regulations and what's potentially achievable. So we'll break this down a little bit, some of the implications of each of those options for adding flexibility. So, and kind of compare against option A on top and option B on the bottom. So option A, we may see more on-street parking if adding housing due to space constraints on the lot, versus option B, with more flexibility, we may be able to fit more cars on the lot, meaning fewer cars on the street. Minimum lot size is what determines the overall size of the parcel. And so considering making smaller minimum lot size means potential to be able to split lots, which could mean if you have a large lot with a large backyard, depending on the overall size of your lot as your starting point, you may be able to subdivide that, sell your backyard to somebody else to build a home, or you could build an ADU and then split it. Overall, the point is leading to more home ownership options. Setbacks, which is often also called perimeter yards, puts open space along the perimeter of the property and creates less usable area overall because you have that land dedicated to the property lines. And making smaller setbacks means building can be located on the edges of the property, which creates more usable area as a whole. And maybe you use that for your building, or maybe you maintain some open space in the middle of your property for what have you, gardening, your dogs, whatever you enjoy. Lot coverage is a term that caps the overall footprint of buildings on your lot. And so a larger lot coverage means larger overall footprints of buildings. And then overall, the upshot is that under option A, maintain, there are going to be some new housing possible, but many homeowners aren't going to be able to build under the current code, and others who can are still limited. And under option B, adding flexibility would mean more homeowners can build more homes on their lot. And again, these visuals are just hypotheticals for illustration. So we want to open it up to you guys now. We're going to be using Mentimeter because that helps get everybody in the room. There's 46 of us here. We want to hear from as many of you as possible. So if you've used Mentimeter before, you know it's pretty simple. Just either in a new window on your laptop or with your phone, you can visit menti.com and type in that 8-digit code, 1601-1465, or you can use your phone to scan that QR code. And in a moment, we'll open it up for you to enter in your comments or questions. And if the technology isn't working for you, please just use the Zoom chat, or you can raise your hand. So with that, I'm going to move along to opening up the first one, which is just, what is your immediate reaction? What are some of your comments? And what are some of your questions that you have about the two-dimensional standard options? And I'm going to bring up the QR code there in the corner as another option. I'll read these aloud in a moment. I'm just going to give some people some time to process and type. And just so you know, in the next slide, we'll give you a chance to actually pick multiple choice, which ones you prefer, just so you know that you're coming. Lots of people who prefer option B. If we're serious about addressing the housing crisis, definitely option B. The options look identical. We can hash that out a little bit more if you have anything that was unclear. More flexibility will allow more housing, creating many more opportunities within the city. With a limited time to digest, option B is what I would favor. Help solve the housing shortage faster. Prefer the citywide option with some flexibility for lot splits. Great, we'll talk more about geography in a moment. Flexibility always has a value. Option B. Minimize on-street parking and maximize space utilization for housing. Would love to see a decrease in setbacks. I would support option B with the maximum flexibility to build new housing, except I don't support parking minimums, prefer street parking to parking in lots. Option A, let's consider how this plays out before leaping in, recognizing that phased approach. We have a few more. As soon as I move to the next slide, that's going to close out any typing that people have. So I'll just give you guys a few more minutes to finish your thoughts. Goal at this point should be a minimum compliance with the legislator to give Tucsonans time to have an actual discussion. Moved here from Burbank. we went through this, now it's way overbuilt, views are blocked, wealthy are saved, poor errors get worth, no grocery, water twos. A, stop and analyze, phased approach. Thank you. Cesar, or anyone monitoring the chat, since I'm not able to see it, please just chime in if there is anything that you want to read aloud, or if the staff in the room could help enter anything into the chat, into the Mentimeter on their behalf. That would be really helpful to get it all in one spot. Of course, we could do that after too. Okay. What is the actual purpose and need? What are we trying to accomplish other than stifling the legislature? How does option B impact housing price projections 20 years or more out? Would this type of option entice developers to sell smaller lots to take advantage of opportunity or sell current size lots? We need to add restrictions for historic neighborhoods. We'll talk about design in a moment, but the historic preservation zones and neighborhood preservation zones are two special districts in our community, two types of special districts that have design criteria that would not be changed. However, anything that's not in an HPZ would not have those same protections, as those of you who are living in a neighborhood like that are probably well aware. I would want option B to increase flexibility. I have no idea if you have asked further questions. Option B, but it should be tied to block development patterns. You are targeting R1. How does this guarantee affordable housing? What keeps these properties from turning into luxury housing? Any regulations around rent control? Option B, we should consider keeping green public spaces to balance urban heat island effect. Thanks everyone for your comments. Regarding targeting R1, we can talk about that in a minute. We have a slide that shows some of the zoning. Yeah, continued. I know there's character counts, but don't worry, on the back end, we can see that your comments are linked. So if you run out of space just like that, on the back end, we'll be able to put it together. So current sized lots for higher premium for opportunity, which may or may not be capitalized on. How does this impact HOA communities? Dan, do we have a better sense of how this will impact HOA communities?
Yeah, so ultimately, I mean, you can still create CC&Rs. This doesn't supersede the any of those rules that are currently for homeowners associations. So it really doesn't have much of an effect on HOAs related to this. I want to I can talk a little bit about some of the questions that we have here. I'm not sure about option B. It just provides more flexibility. So hopefully it provides for more potentially housing being developed. I think there was the question about if you go down a little bit, how does this guarantee affordable housing? What keeps these properties from turning into luxury housing? As is, we can't make any of the standards any more restrictive than those for normal single family homes. And so ultimately, this is really intended to it's really intended to allow for this housing type. It doesn't have any restrictions or anything of that sort related to affordable housing. I did present a little bit earlier, just naturally what ends up happening with a lot of this is that because they're smaller units or they're rental units or how the format is, they generally are cheaper than like a single family detached home. And then related to rent control, I think Ben had answered this in the chat, but the state does not allow for us to put any sort of rent control or anything of that sort on things.
And then this comment here about what's the actual purpose and need. We are required by the state to do this. So the minimum requirements, option A, would be meeting the state requirements, and then option B, if there's any other additional goals, is where we might look at making any additional changes that we've talked about.
Yeah,
So
and I think and I think that's that's part of it, right? I think I mean, it's right. It's like you have the state requirements, but we're looking at it, and mayor and council, I believe, are looking at it as an opportunity to look at our zoning code to encourage a housing type that we're really not seeing a lot of development for, which provides for more options, but also helps with some of the supply issues that we're having as far as just the needs of our community and keeping up with the growing population that we have.
great. I'm going to move on to the actual part where we're going to ask you to rate and choose your favorite. And while people are choosing their preferences, so we have in white option A, maintain. Option B is full flexibility everywhere we can. And then there's a bunch of partial options, option Bs, where if you want us to look at some of those dimensional standards but not others, you could choose from that range. Something else entirely, please let us know what you have in mind, and then obviously no preference. And then while people are voting, I just want to give an opportunity to any other staff who've seen anything in the chat that needs to be vocalized. Please jump in. I can't see it.
Yeah, there were a few people that put their responses in here. So Wesley put in, I would want the option B to increase flexibility. And then I have no idea if you have asked further questions. I can't keep up. Um, let's see. There was a question, yeah, about historic as well. Just what historic regulations would this have? So existing historic regulations would remain in place. There are, again, some of those restrictions related to uh, and single family that would kind of maybe make the analysis a little different for the development zone, but in general, HPZs and NPZs would remain in place for this. But we just have to, again, remember that the restrictions can't be any different from the existing or from the single family regulations. So for that. I have a question. What about multiple tiny homes on lots near good mass transit with incentives not to have a car? Are these in the class that is non-investable? Um, I think it's probably challenging, Jason, but I think this and I think actually the community corridors tool do kind of get at trying to loosen things up to allow for that type of development in and around transit potentially for that. And then the parking requirements, that's a part of the conversation on whether or not, the state mandates that we can't require any more than one per unit, but there is always the possibility to reduce the parking potentially.
Thanks, Dan. Any other last minute votes before we move on? For the 4 people who said something else entirely, would you please indulge us by putting your ideas in the chat for us so that we know what you had in mind? And we'll go ahead and just to keep us on time, let's start talking about the geography options. So as a reminder, per the state bill, there's a minimum requirement, and then there are some ways that we might be able to expand beyond the minimums. And so we're going to talk about what those minimum options are first. So if the original bill language said a 1-mile buffer from a central business district, and then the bill goes ahead and defines central business district, which makes it interesting for us because we have 4 options that actually meet the definition of a central business district as outlined in the bill language. One of them is the central business district, and then there are these 3 others: the downtown infill incentive district, the Rio Nuevo district, and the downtown business improvement district. And then shown here is that 1-mile buffer off of each one of those. And if you watched the April 22nd or so presentation to Mayor and Council, this is what you saw as what we were looking at. The challenges with these is that, as you can see, the overall shape is really irregular, and it bisects parcels, and it doesn't really follow local context. So we also looked at going a little bit beyond the minimum to make sure that we were also looking at keeping neighborhoods intact, not splitting any parcels in the middle, since that's an issue that we were trying to resolve through some of our other code initiatives recently. We wanted to look at aligning with our transit and street networks. And then, of course, zoning is super important, as somebody brought up during the last discussion. So, and on this last map here, the current zoning map, I want to just name the lighter tan color that you see kind of concentrated in the middle is our R2, which is where, and R3, which is where middle housing is currently allowed. And then any of that lighter banana yellow is where is our R1 or smaller zoning, so some of our rural residential zones in the outskirts. And that is where we would be seeing the most change. So when we drew these, we were keeping in mind everything I just mentioned, the minimum area, the keeping neighborhoods intact, following the street network and city jurisdictional boundaries, and then looking at trying to be the most realistic with our zoning. And so I want to show this map, and I'll walk through what our different choices are here because I just think it's a little bit easier to read. So you can think of it as 4 options, each with a variation that either goes up Campbell or Country Club, for a total of 8. And so the northern boundary is the primary distinction. I don't think I can get my cursor to show up for you guys, I'm sorry. So we have one option that follows Grant. We have another option, and that's the yellow. And we have another option that goes up to Fort Lowell in green. A third option goes up to Prince in orange. And then the final option is blue that goes all the way up to Wetmore. The curved area to the northwest is our city boundary. And then it follows the I-10 down back to Grant. And then if you go kind of counterclockwise to the west, all of the different options have the same western boundary of following Silver Bell, going out and over to make sure Panorama Estates is not just bisected, and then we're following the minimum area and then following some neighborhood boundaries down. The southern boundary is also the same for all of them. We go east and west along Silver Lake, up and over around the jurisdictional boundary for the city of South Tucson, and then over and then up again, where it starts to split off into a solid line and a dotted line. The dotted line is showing that country club variation. When we were looking at the zoning, we saw Campbell as a potential natural boundary, and we also saw country club as a potential natural boundary. So that's what I mean by there's sort of 4 options given the northern boundary, each with a variation going up either Campbell or country club. I'm sure that that's a little bit unclear. I did my best. Please put clarifying questions in the chat and we can go back and answer anything. In addition to the minimum area that's required, we know that there's a lot of need for middle housing everywhere. Also, some of the most vulnerable areas happen to be downtown. Shown here is a picture of the gray are the areas of the City of Tucson's Equity Priority Index, which is made by our Office of Equity, which considers a variety of factors that would create an area to be more socially vulnerable. So things like income, renting status, many others. And there's a lot of overlap between the areas that we are required to consider and highly vulnerable communities. And not to mention, they also have been the focus of a lot of intense development pressure over the years. And so between the idea of limiting it to a downtown area means you're concentrating all of the perceived benefits of more housing choice, as well as burden of additional changes to that area. And like I mentioned at the start, recent studies from the county show that there's demand for middle housing pretty evenly throughout all of the jurisdictions countywide, at least on the eastern half of the county. So that's a long way of saying we looked at some options of going beyond the minimum and spreading it out beyond a downtown. And some of those options would be major corridors. And the other option would be citywide, with the exclusion of the areas around the airport, where there are other state and local regulations that limit density. And so with that, once again, we're going to go back to that same Mentimeter. We want to hear your thoughts and comments first, and then there will be a way to choose your preferences. Please go ahead and go to menti.com, type in that code there on the screen or use your QR code, and then we'll go ahead and get started with logging any of your comments. Maximizing utilization of existing space to increase housing options and limit the cost of infrastructure. Option B, dimensional standards flexibility is great. Alley access, flexibility, increasing potential new housing to rent or subdivide and sell, increasing the amount of attainable homes within the city, especially in certain corridors. Love option B across the board so far, include the whole city. So I think some of those comments are carryovers from the previous conversation, but that's totally fine. Include the whole city. Expanding the potential for higher density housing to as wide an area as possible, distribution of flexibility across the city's preferred, support citywide, easier to limit gentrifications if neighborhoods change slowly over the whole city instead of all at once. Need to cover broader geography, link to community corridors, maximize housing opportunities throughout the city, not just downtown, University, Campbell. This isn't really enough time to have a well-informed opinion. Phased system would probably be best. Flexibility is great. Please consider creating streamlined processes for implementation. Start small until we understand what the impacts are. Short term, buy time to have a more inclusive and constructive conversation rather than dancing to the legislature's tune. Broader geography, citywide with protections for historic. Citywide because we have a long way to go to address the housing shortage. At least the biggest option you showed on the maps. Building housing for the upcoming youth. Real quick, any city staff members noticed clarifying questions in the chat about what the minimum geographies are, or what our options are? No? Okay, thank you. Include the whole city, otherwise we'll never have enough housing. Incentivize higher buildings along major corridors. Give it just a little bit more time before we vote. Ownership potential via lot splits is crucial for actually affordable housing. If single parcels are developed with 4 houses that cannot be sold separately, we will have a housing stock controlled by LLCs. Housing and transit are complementary, thus when and where there is a need to make impactful change, such as option B, there would need to equal changes made to transit, especially for your east, right? I see your point. Consider gentrification impacts on central Tucson. Historic areas should have limited protection. They often have the best transit infrastructure, access to services. This is the most impactful and valuable area and should have the most options. Is there a way to require some or all of the current multifamily commercial requirements for properties with 3 or more units? Landscaping, pedestrian circulation, ADA, etc. We'll talk about design in a moment with Nick. But yes, that is one of the things that we've been directed by Mayor and Council to consider with everybody. There's a lot of R2 that could be targeted. Currently, it is not clear. Fiscal impact of greater density. All right, I'll give everybody just a few more seconds to finish up your thoughts. These efforts extend, then there may be competing interests that may not be interested in such efforts coming to a head. Country Club alignment is great. Midtown has much larger lots that could easily support this density versus tiny downtown and barrio lots. All right. We're going to go ahead and move on. If you are a person who takes a little bit longer to process, don't worry, we'll leave the Mentimeter open. So if anything else occurs to you, you can comment later tonight or tomorrow morning. But I want to start getting a clear vote. We'll talk about the citywide in a moment, but since we have to have a minimum, we would love to see what choices best match your preferred minimum geography. So there are those 8 options. The yellow is Grant, and then the Campbell Country Club option, and then so on and so forth. And if you have no preference, there's the last one there for you. We'll give it just one more minute. All right, seems to have slowed down some. According to the tally, only about half the people in the room have voted, so I'm a little leery of moving on, but like I said before, I'll leave it open until you can come back and vote after the meeting. Moving on in 3, 2, 1. I saw one person snuck theirs in there. So thinking then beyond the minimum, let us know your preferences. Should we stick to the minimum only and don't expand? That's the blue. And then there's the minimum along corridors, citywide option, keeping in mind that this can be a phased approach as well. Or if there's something else entirely not minimum or not along corridors and not citywide, you can vote for the pink. All right. Sounds a little easier for people to answer, I can tell. We'll give it just a few more seconds. Seeing a clear preference for citywide. Sounds good. Thank you so much. But there's definitely a few people who are cautious about expanding beyond the minimum, and we see that too. For the person who said something else, we would love it if you would just put your explanation in the chat so we can understand what you had in mind. And with that, I'm going to move along and pass it over to Nick, who's going to talk about some of the other implications as well as the building and site design priorities that we've mentioned. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Amanda, and thanks, Dan. Also, appreciate all the questions and comments here. So somebody touched on this earlier. We also need to address some of the building and site design priorities for these, and that was the question regarding ADA spaces, commercial standards and things of that nature. So part of that is going to be looking at design criteria. And what I mean by that is some of the functional elements of the site and the building. So think anything outside of your building, like sidewalk areas, any accessibility issues, and then even on the building, so design, so paint color, architectural elements, and things of that nature. So in the city of Tucson already, if you're building your house on a regular lot that's not in any sort of special zoning or any sort of flexible lot development subdivision, you'll have pretty minimal standards when it comes to functional elements of a site and a building. Building a residential on a residential lot really makes it's easier that way because there's just not as many standards that you'd have to adhere to. So some of the design guidelines you can find though are in flexible lot developments. Think about some of those smaller subdivisions or larger subdivisions on the outskirts of town, planned area developments like rezonings, overlays, special districts like the historic preservation zone, national preservation zone. Those have some standards, but they are not standards in our regular underlying zoning. So aside from some of those special district areas, there are really few design standards in the UDC. Commercial standards right now apply to lots with 3 or more units, and that would require landscaping, site design standards, pedestrian safety, and more, like think fire sprinklers for multifamily units. Because of this House bill, we now need to change our zoning code for that to be 5+ units, because we cannot require somebody to adhere to commercial standards any longer for 3 or 4 units. So we're going to have to change that in our zoning code to 5 or more units per the House bill. So certain issues will still need to be addressed. So we may need to add some minimal design criteria for the 1 to 4 unit developments. And that was what somebody had a good question about, to cover some of those minimum needs of safety, quality, and just to make sure that we have a better product out there. Next slide, please. So a couple of things we might consider, minimum landscape requirements. So right now, if you're doing something on a residentially zoned lot, again, that's 1 or 2 residences, then you don't need to do any minimum landscape requirements. We could look at that as an option here. We're trying to get your feedback on that. For instance, the city of Phoenix, I believe, for residential lots requires 1 tree and 5 shrubs, and then dust proofing cover and irrigation. So start thinking about things like that we can require for residential lots as well. Wall and fence materials are another thing. Site design standards like sidewalks around the building, pedestrian and vehicular connectivity, shared driveways for homes with multiple units, and then shaded parking. In terms of the actual building, we could start thinking about things like detailing and colors, front entry architectural features, and also just materials. For example, some of our zoning, if you're in a certain area and within a certain distance of a major street, require no reflective surfaces for safety purposes. So let's bust out Mentimeter again. So let's talk a little bit about comments and questions that you might have on some design priorities here. So just thinking about either on the site or for the building. And again, if you don't use Mentimeter and you don't have access to Mentimeter, we're recording anything that you have in the chat, and we're happy to take that from there.
If there are no, oh, here we go. I was going to say, if there are no comments or questions, we can move along, but I see they're starting to come in now.
All right, so shaded parking, waterways, 90% of time cars sit unused. Shade should be for pedestrian, bikers, sidewalks in general, not required for cars. Minimum number of trees and white roofs. The legislation requires a minimum or default to a maximum. Why are we talking about design priorities? There needs to be meaningful standards. Don't agree with covering everything with gravel. Allow main entrances along easements, not parallel to main home entrance. Currently, the lot has to be 0.27 acres or larger to build a fourplex. I'm not sure if lot size requirements are part of this discussion, and we must add trees. See, trees and shrubs, great to address climate change, but water demand goes up because you would need irrigation. Would these design requirements need to apply to all residential zones or only to zones affected in the area we ultimately designate for the Middle Housing Code Amendment? So I believe, to answer that question, I believe this would have to be citywide because we would have to change our zoning code to not be more restrictive than HB 2721. Depending on setback requirements, landscaping requirements may need to be dynamic. It could be difficult to crush a tree and 5 shrubs into minimal exposed lots. Anything to mitigate heat island. As far as parking, I'd like to see a restriction of the number of vehicles allowed and not parking on the yard. See, require sidewalks to increase walkability and ground cover to minimize dust. Architectural standards to reflect existing standards of surrounding homes. Appealing common areas with landscaping that prompts community and socializing, much like a courtyard, and minimum lots for cars. See, agree to shading. Shading for cars is very low priority. Lot coverage scale, especially high vegetation, maintain trees, open space in relationship to street, ADA accessibility and compliance. I think it's crucial to have some requirements for landscaping and pedestrian connections. Otherwise, many developers often do the minimum. Would a garden level, partial basement level reduce costs and mitigate height restrictions? Will new builds follow the design of current homes, or will it become sticks and stucco in some areas? Design priorities should follow from purpose and need. Let's establish and clarify those. This is premature. I encourage keeping it simple and easy to understand so the permitting process is easier for homeowners that want to build more housing. Agree with requiring a few trees and shrubs. No minimum parking. No design priorities for irrigation. Shaded parking is an option, but not required. Color that seems arbitrary, ignoring a historic zone. Also strongly support requiring sidewalks and preferably requiring shade for it. 3 trees is an easy requirement and low barrier. Owners are eligible for 3 trees per year through TEP for $5 each. I support this. Parking on lot for each unit, garden, covered play area, trees for shading, porch for each, laundry on site, walkable to amenities. If not walkable to amenities, have a multi-purpose store on lot. And then will sidewalks be mandatory? Many slide by now without. And then flexibility on entrance, including on easement.
Amanda, do you mind going up to the top real quickly? So there was a comment there that says, let's be clear, the legislation requires a minimum or a default to a maximum. Why are we talking about design priorities? So Peter, I'm assuming this is you because I think you made a comment about this, about change is limited. And so ultimately this is the situation we're in here, is that it requires you to be no more restrictive than what we require for single family homes. And single family homes, when you do a one-off or 1 or 2 or whatever, do not have any design or landscape standards. And so what ends up happening is that now you have like a fourplex that'll come in, but because there's no landscaping standards, there's no sidewalks, access standards for sidewalks, anything of that sort, or design standards. It's really it gets rid of a lot of the things that are currently in there for those 3 or more units. And that's the reason why we're having this conversation, is where is that balance to where we're going to have to require this of new single family homes as well. So it's a change to those to make it more restrictive, but then you also you want to think about how it applies to a four unit essentially. And that's why we're talking about it, is really finding that balance of what are the appropriate design standards that would apply from 1 to 4 units. Most of the actual design standards that you see with single family homes are related to subdivision standards, and that's where they live. So in a subdivision, you'll see some of that stuff, but when you do like an infill project for a single family home, you just don't have any.
Yeah, that's right, Peter.
Yep.
There was one more question in there, I think, Amanda.
Oh, yeah. There was one other one. If you don't mind going
I
up real
think
quickly, I'm sorry.
more in the middle. Oh, would garden level, partial basement level reduce costs and mitigate height restrictions? I can't speak to cost. I do know going in basement level is a little bit more expensive just because of digging here. But it would height restrictions would be from the from design grade, so it would count toward height. How does this relate to issues like the transportation priorities, concerns about pedestrian and neighborhood community considerations? Is that in regard to the major streets and routes plan?
I'm interpreting it as kind of similar to the other question, but also just yes, making sure that what is getting developed is supporting and is kind of meets the community goals as
Hmm.
well for this. So I think it goes back to that minimum standard and what is that minimum standard for all four.
Looks like one more comment here. If sidewalks are required, the owner should be able to have the city install them for a fixed cost per linear foot to offer an affordable option and ensure engineering standards are met.
We'll move along then. Um,
So next question for the Menti, and again, feel free to put this in the chat if you don't have Menti, but what kinds of design priorities should we explore further? There's a few options, and then of course there's none of these or other. So far, it's looking like quite a bit with landscape ground cover, driveways, and sidewalks. A few more for fences and walls.
all right. Thank you so much. We'll go on with the presentation, but just, again, well, you've said it before, but the Mentimeter will be staying open if you need a little bit more time. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So some other important changes that we need to address too are household size, and I'll get into that here in a little bit. Some building code changes, and then some of the requirements for large lot developments from the House bill. So right now, when it comes to house size and group dwellings in our Unified Development Code, which is our zoning code for the entire city, we have a little bit different standard than what House Bill 2721 is requiring us to adhere to. So when they're talking about duplexes, they say duplexes are defined as two independent households, fourplexes as four independent households. And that gets important here in a minute. Household means either A, a single person living or residing in a dwelling or place of residence, or B, two or more persons living together or residing in the same dwelling or place of residence. Right now in the city of Tucson, group dwellings are currently only allowed in the R3 and some commercial zones. So the residential occupancy of a permanent structure, and so our definition of group dwelling here is the residential occupancy of a permanent structure by five or more unrelated persons or by one or more individuals where the individual or group of individuals has the exclusive right of occupancy to a bedroom. So, and I'll get into this just a second to break this down a little bit because it's a little complicated, but some low density zones have stricter standards for group dwellings, and then this change will apply citywide and not solely within these middle housing areas. So, next slide, and I will explain this a little bit more. So one of the use-specific standards in our current zoning code is 497B8. You can think of those as conditions of developing a home or developing any use in a zone. So right now, it's a condition of developing homes in the R1 and some of the suburban zones, thinking about like the MH1 zone, SR zone, things that you see more on the outskirts of town, but are not limited to those areas. That will conflict with the definition of household per House Bill 2721. So if there's more than one dwelling, it conflicts because if one or more dwellings on a lot, all dwellings on a lot are considered to be one dwelling for the purpose of determining whether it's a group dwelling. That differs from what House Bill 27 or what our current zoning code says, because this is lumping it into all the dwellings on one lot. So if you have 3 homes on one lot, you're likely going to be in conflict with our zoning code right now. So this says if there are 5 or more unrelated persons residing on that lot, as opposed to one house, is a group dwelling, and that is not permitted. So let's just take the R1 zone as an example. If you have 3 homes on there and multiple people living in all 3 of those homes, they would, under our current zoning code, count as one group dwelling as opposed to different houses on the same lot. So building multiple units on the same lot could push potential developments into group dwelling territory, which is not an allowed use in many zones. So a code amendment is going to need to change this and eliminate that conflict so that you can build more homes on lots without all of those homes being grouped into one home and being considered a group dwelling. And group dwellings a lot of times are thought of as like those mini dorms that are near campus. And so that just protects you from being able to build more units on there without being considered a group dwelling. I suspect there may be questions about that, but I'm happy to answer those as they come. Next slide, please. Regarding some building code changes, there are different building codes for different types of residential development. Right now, if you're building 1 or 2 units on a lot, you're going to be adhering to the IRC or the International Residential Code, and that's something that currently you would adhere to today. The International Building Code, however, is used for projects which are considered commercial that are 3 or more units per lot. And so because House Bill 2721 says we cannot require people to build to that building code, we're going to need to change that from 3+ units to 5+ units. Some of the big considerations there are fire sprinklers and some of the things you all touched on already in your comments. Pedestrian circulation, landscaping, and things like that. So now developments with up to 4 residential units will be using the IRC, and then 5+ units will be using the IBC. One more thing I want to touch on regarding some code changes is the change to large lot developments. For developments larger than 10 acres, so a lot of the times that's just going to be subdivisions, kind of like the homes you see in this picture, must allow for 20% of residential lots as middle housing per the House Bill 2721. That doesn't mean they have to be built there, but they have to set aside 20% of all their residential lots to allow for it. So if a homeowner wants to buy a piece of property, they can put those units on there. Right now, sometimes that's a little bit restricted with our current residential density standards. So this will potentially impact flexible lot developments, which is most of our subdivisions that are built in the city, and then larger rezonings, and then it will also affect some subdivision standards to allow or to require that they can build on 20% of those lots. So a few next steps. We went to Mayor and Council in April, and they asked us to come talk to you all, come talk to the public about some of these options. And that's why we've kept it kind of broad, talking about either citywide or corridors or in certain geographic areas. And so we're doing our initial public outreach. We had a meeting last week. We have one right now, and then we're doing another one tomorrow afternoon. June and July, we're going to take some additional analysis and start developing some potential codes for the mayor and council to review. And then August 2025, we're going to continue our public engagement to share those proposed code amendments, get some feedback on that. And then we're aiming to go to Planning Commission September and October. They're the ones that review different zoning documents and code changes. And then we are looking to go to mayor and council in November, December, because we ultimately have a January 1st deadline. And if we don't meet that deadline, then this becomes a citywide tool automatically. So we're under a pretty tight timeline, but we are going to be doing some public feedback information sessions as we go along. So this is our upcoming outreach. Obviously, today's the Wednesday, May 28th, but we're also doing the Thursday, May 29th, 11:30 to 1 p.m. People are more than welcome to sign up for that Zoom meeting. And we're looking to collect feedback on these preferred development standards and geography, as you all have already helped us out with today. And then, as promised, any final thoughts you have, we have another Mentimeter. You can either use the QR code, and you're also welcome to put things in the chat too. So any remaining questions and comments you may have, feel free to add them. Holding engagement events in Spanish as well. Thank you. So currently with fourplexes, you need to submit a development package created by a civil engineer. Does this step get removed after this bill is passed? So the requirement for a development package would go away. There are some things that we would need to discuss in terms of what design professionals are required for what. Will there be any financial incentives to encourage big lot owners to build homes? And I'm assuming that means for the subdivisions. So as of now, I don't believe we can require any sort of incentive to build homes. And you might correct me on that, Dan.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things to the idea of how do you incentivize people to develop vacant land, especially vacant land like within the city. As of now, we don't really have a lot of tools for that, but that is something that I have seen work elsewhere, but not related to this, at least right now.
Thanks. And then thank you for all your work on this. Great job, despite the sometimes tough questions. Thank you. This was very interesting. Never knew how complicated it can be. I agree. Thanks for your work on this. I would like to consider the unanticipated consequences before going ahead with any of the options. In conjunction with this code update, I would love to see us revisit 831 land split requirements. Many lots were split long ago and are not eligible for their simple splits. That's definitely something we can consider. And if you have any comments or questions on that, we're happy to include that. Is there any communication with state officials when questions come up? Yes, we have spoken with state officials and other municipalities about this when questions have come up, and we'll continue to do so. Thanks for the consideration of multiple options. Will lot size for triplexes and fourplexes change? Like you need to have a lot greater than 0.27 acres to build a fourplex for the new bill. What does this look post January 2026? Really good question. So as of right now, if you were to have a lot within this defined area that we're going to figure out, there would not be a lot size limitation there. So you could build a triplex or a fourplex. What that could look like in terms of splitting a lot, I think that's something that we're going to need to explore a little bit more. Consider how tiny homes can be an investable option in complying with this bill. With incentives to not need parking, we need another starter home option for young people. How does this relate to single stair reform? I assume all these middle houses could be built with single staircases instead of two as required in some apartments. Is that true? I believe that most of these are going to be in the style of a duplex, triplex, or quadplex. And typically, most of those don't end up usually going over the 2 stories, although more than 2 stories are allowed in some zones. But I assume that most of these will be single stair. And Dan, you unmuted for a second.
Yeah, so I know that we've been following kind of other communities, and I think Dallas just passed something related to single stair requirements. So it is something that we're looking at. That would be kind of an amendment to the building code, but also something that I think is being discussed by our joint uh, code committee related to the building code. So it is something we are following.
Thank you. My main interest in all of this is keeping the Virgin Desert free of new housing. Do you have any estimates how much housing these rules could provide, like how many Savanos avoided? That's a really good question. We're happy to follow up and share some of the research that the Drockman Institute provided for us. That gives us a little bit better idea of what kind of housing we could see, and then kind of some projections of where we would see that housing. So we'll definitely be sharing that with you all. Really happy to see community support for citywide middle housing, and thanks to the city again for answering tough questions. Kindly give local builders priority. Idea that costs continue to increase because of the opportunity for more in various capacities. Would love to see minimum lot size restrictions as follows: R1 to 3,000 square feet, R2 and R3 5,000. There's plenty of precedent for the viability of these in Iron Horse, Barrio Historico, Armory Park, etc. Definitely something we can look at when we're doing these code updates as well. Looks like some of those are slowing down. Were there any questions in the chat that I might have missed? Let's see. William asked, has water been taken into consideration at all in this increased development? After all, we are seeing less water in the form of rain, and the state has increased the population in all of the major locals. What I can say is that all of the different requirements that are already need to be adhered to when you're doing development still have to be completed. So water studies, water has to be. Oh, looks like someone's replying. And so, oh yeah, there you go, Dan.
William, I responded to you. Yeah, so in general, just it's something that we're definitely working on in a number of different ways, not necessarily directly related to this, but more dense development does use less water in general. So as you densify, instead of growing outward, it uses less water. We're also working on low impact development standards to reduce irrigation needs that could help us reduce water use. And then we've done a number of building code amendments to make development more efficient. One of which was water sense fixture requirements and removing turf, making a turf prohibition essentially. Thanks.
Thanks, Dan. Let's see. If neighborhoods want historical exceptions, would it be possible for this to be an opt-in, not automatic, as in require a certain percentage of signatures from residents? I don't see that in the bill. The language seems pretty clear that it is required, that we have to allow it. Doesn't mean that it's going to get built or anything like that, but if it's in that area, we have to allow it. And then I'm assuming historical exceptions, like if it's in an HPZ or something, you would still have to comply with historic preservation zone requirements as is. Okay. I think we're getting close to time. It looks like we're starting to wind down with some of the questions. Like Amanda said, we're going to keep this open. So if you have any other statements, feel free to add them. If you would like to get a hold of anybody, my name is on the invitations, and feel free to get with me. I'm happy to answer any of your questions as well, or direct you to staff. But we really appreciate everyone's time and energy being here. Is that the last slide, Amanda, I believe?
Yeah, it is.
Yeah. Yeah, we really appreciate everyone's time and energy being here, and we're happy to answer any questions. And all your responses and questions were very helpful.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Really appreciate it. Hope you have a nice evening.